welcome everybody in the room to this Non-Fiction Lab Reading Publics event. It's the second in the series that the Non-Fiction Lab here at RMIT has put on in this series, and we're really delighted to be able to bring together three great speakers who'll be talking about their own particular interests, research interests around what we're calling reading publics, reading socialities, and how reading in all its various practices and habits and techniques that we have for that can actually be formative of socialities. So I won't take up any further the prompt and the rationale for today's talk. Brigid will shortly introduce each of the speakers, but before she does that, I'd like to acknowledge, make an acknowledgement of country where I'm located, and many of you are not far away, although we do have Roger, I know, who's geographically quite a way to the north in Cairns. So I'd like to acknowledge the Yalukit Willam people of the Kulin Nations, on whose country where I'm working and living here today, and I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and particularly those elders of the Yalukit Willam people who are working on language retrieval of the Boonwurrung language itself, really important work of sovereignty. I'd also like to pay my respects to all First Nations peoples right across the continent and beyond. But in terms of this continent, always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to my colleague Brigid Magner, who's going to introduce each of the speakers. And before Brigid arrived into the session, we agreed that we'd go alphabetically. So Torika, Jodi and Roger. Just an update, Brigid, there. Okay.
Great. I'll just give a very brief background to the session itself. So Linda and I were asked to convene a session, and we're both really interested in reading as teachers and as researchers, and we recently co-authored a paper for the conversation about audiobooks, which just had an explosive response. There were so many comments that they went on for ages, and we realised that was an area of great interest for some members of the public, and so we decided to continue with our interest in reading and work together on that. But I'm also involved with an ARC funded project called Reading in the Mallee with Torika and our wonderful colleague Emily Potter from Deakin, and we've been working in the Mallee region of Victoria, and one of the goals of that is to explore the rich and diverse literary history of the region, and to create dialogue between writers, readers and place to bring Mallee literary production to life for a wider audience. And a large part of that is collaboration with readers through reading groups and other kinds of provocations, both traditional and non-traditional. And Torika is going to be talking a bit about her element of the project today, which is very exciting. And her community reading room project has been ongoing for a number of years. So that's some background and the reason why Reading in the Mallee is part of this session today. So I'll now introduce Torika, because her last name starts with the B. So Torika is a Fijian Australian artist working across a range of media, including photography, video, projection, publication and installation. So she's multi-talented, and her work shifts between the languages of documentary, archival recovery, reenactment and abstraction to explore the tensions and intersections between race, gender, power, commodification and globalisation. And her community reading room project, which I just mentioned, engages with reading communities commonly excluded from mainstream literary practices, collections and spaces. And at the moment we're lucky enough to have her at RMIT teaching in the School of Art. So welcome, Torika.
Thank you, Brigid, and thank you, Linda. It's lovely to be here today. I would like to start with a bit of sort of information about the community reading room and sort of where it sort of emerged from. So the concept for the community reading room emerged after I visited the Stuart Hall Library in 2011. And I was living in Canberra on maternity leave, and I was away from work and my network of peers, community of artists. And in that couple of years that I was away, there was this incredible group of artists connecting and dreaming up a festival to showcase Pacific arts practices in Australia. And these conversations really birthed the what became the Contemporary Pacific Arts Festival, which ran from 2013 to 2015 at the Footscray Community Arts Centre. I was sort of looped in with a whole bunch of emails when that was sort of, you know, being drawn up, and I actually found the original email that I sent, what was it, September 2011, to some of the other artists, where I said, look, I just wanted to put an idea out there too and see what your thoughts are. So I spent a couple of weeks at INEVA, which is the International Institute for Visual Arts in London, earlier this year, doing research at the Stuart Hall Library. I've always felt like libraries are home for me, but imagine being in a library that only contains books about theory and art by non-white artists, gender, visual culture theory. I was in heaven. Smiley face. Imagine an Australian version that would focus on Indigenous Australia and the Pacific, as well as our brothers and sisters in the Northern Hemisphere. So it's always been a dream of mine to open a similar community service, a reading room, non-loan resource centre that could also host panel discussions, guest lectures, education programs, children's workshops, etc. It could also host high school, tertiary research visits from progressive schools. And then I realised that I already have a healthy start to such a collection. I could donate my collection of books to be used by the public and then run some fundraisers to gradually add to the collection. I've stayed with tertiary lecturing because of the opportunity it provides to teach the stuff I wasn't taught, but I'm feeling stifled by the environment. My heart is moving away from the bureaucracy of it all. It's not connected enough with the community and everything moves too slowly. It's not dynamic enough. So I'm just putting it out there for your thoughts, advice. Anyone want to work on it with me? I just don't know where to start, I suppose, but these books are burning a hole on my shelf and need to be shared with the community in a meaningful way. And a community resource like this gives permanency to festivals, it creates longevity and a point of reference for future generations. So that was sort of the initial, I guess, proposal that I put out there. And that sort of turned into an invitation from a fellow artist called Amy Batalabasi. So she opened a place called Colourbox Studios, which was situated in Nicholson Street in an old tattoo parlour that was on its way to being knocked down to make way for new apartments. She set up this initiative called Colourbox in 2013, and it became a really important hub for local artists and makers. And she invited me to install the reading room collection there after hearing about it through our shared Pacific Art Network. It was a great way to test out the idea and see how the community responded. Artists held meetings in the space and reading groups. Another artist delivered a participatory community postcard project from the space. And Amy supported all the projects with documentation and interviews that have formed part of the Colourbox archive as they transitioned from a physical space to an online platform when the building was actually demolished. The first visitors to the reading room were students on their way to and from the VU campus at the end of the street, local community just wandering past, responding to the books that were up in the window because it had great street frontage. And artists and others who travelled specifically to visit the installation. And then after a visit from the CEO of the Footscray Community Arts Centre at the time, the reading room was then invited to take up residency in their old shop space inside the gallery. So it was a great little nook near the reception desk, for those who know the space. And it was the first time that the reading room was situated inside an existing art organisation, really changing the context and the demographic and the expectations of the visitors to the space. And that's one of the things that I'm really interested in with each iteration of the reading room, is how the audience changes and then the interaction with the collection changes with that as well. So a couple of years later, I applied to take the reading room to the original testing ground site, which was located behind the NGV and the Australian Ballet Centre down in South Bank. And in 2017, the reading room was in residence in the White Cube there for 3 weeks. I invited Natasha Paris, who is another artist working with plants, to create a living jungle inside the empty cube around my book installation. And together we created a green oasis inside the existing concrete infrastructure. From that, British Rwandan artist and composer Stephanie Kabanyana Kanyandekwe was the reader in residence for the duration of the installation, and she made new works and hosted in conversation with her librarian father about what she considered to be the inherent biases in library cataloguing systems. And over the 3 weeks, African Australian arts collective Still Nomads hosted a zine fair, a spoken word open mic event, and the Sydney theatre collective Blackbirds travelled down to deliver their show called Third Culture. A little later on that year at Arts House, the reading room was part of the Displace and Displant program and was in residence for 2 weeks. Still Nomads hosted another zine making workshop, and the Reading Oceania group held their monthly meeting and reading from that space, which sort of happened virtually as well. The reading room went back to testing grounds in 2019 for a project I titled Black Tourmaline, and it was a space to consider the inclusivity of our education system, problematise resilience narratives, and contemplate how our institutions acknowledge privilege particular ways of knowing and being. And during that 6 weeks, Laniuk, Negro Speaks of Books, Mary Quinsakara, Black School and Bizet Walku, Denise Chapman and I curated a program of events and installations, including panel discussions and workshops for focused reflection on how Black, Indigenous and people of colour experience mainstream education in an Australian context, with an emphasis on healing, self-determination, dreaming and visioning. Transforming the passive library into a participatory project, the artist invited the public to create an archive of lived experiences by contributing anonymous written reflections of their own education. My collaborators programmed restorative yoga classes for folks of colour, closed poetry workshops for First Nations writers, reading groups, writing workshops and B-Girls ciphers and symposiums. So the pop-up has served the project really well as I've sort of juggled presenting the project with full-time work and my own arts practice and parenting. But I'm in the process of trying to find a more permanent home for the reading room and to realise the original intention behind the space, which was to house an archive of books and ephemera that centres the creative practices of our kin, ancestors and peers to create a life-affirming space that values the breadth and depth of creative practices and art writing that exist outside the Western canon. It is intended as a welcoming space for marginalised folks to be in contemplation and in conversation with each other without the weight of the institutional gaze. And so locally, there have been some really exciting reading groups and spaces emerging over the past few years that you might be aware of already, like the Dat Nhok Library, a community curated collection of texts from Vietnam, and the Diaspora, who aims to encourage collective literacy, shared archives and connection. The Incendium Radical Library is a collectively run independent community space and info shop. Negro Speaks of Books is an online platform and sometimes located reading group that discusses literature by Black authors. Culture Crate, a First Nations run book collection promoting inclusion and diversity in children and YA literature. And more recently, Murmur Library, a library for voices and stories to exist outside the white gaze. So my current research is looking at the legacy of women who have set up their community libraries by making their own collections available to the public. So I'm looking at the Martha Rosler Library, the Sister Library by Akwetami in Mumbai, and the Free Black Women's Library that was established in New York by Olaronke Akinmowo. And that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you. That's great.
Thank you so much, Torika. There's so much to think about there. And I think people probably want to have a list of those sources and links to check out later. I don't know how we can do that, but we can do it maybe. Maybe when we send out the recording, we can send out some sources from all the speakers. And excuse the noise of my partner making a coffee in the background. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce Jodi McAlister, who is a senior lecturer at Deakin University and the School of Communication and Creative Arts, and former colleague of Torika's, I believe, when Torika was at Deakin. And her research interests include representations of romantic love and popular genre fiction. And she's also an author, and her new novels, Libby Lawrence is Good at Pretending and Here for the Right Reasons, will be released in 2022. So she's also got a range of interests and talents, and I'd love to know when those books are out, but you can tell us more.
Yeah, I absolutely can tell you more. Libby Lawrence is out on Sunday, so out in 2 days, May 1. And then Here for the Right Reasons will be out in July, so a little bit longer for that one. So what should be evident from the way that Brigid introduced me there is that my own practice is very entangled. My author identity and my academic identity are very kind of tangled up in each other, and they inform each other. I think my bio on TikTok, which my publisher just made me get kind of against my will, is writes romance, writes about romance. And so I think that really shows how much the two sides reinforce each other. And that entanglement is something that I'm really, really interested in my scholarly practice. And when I was a baby scholar, when I was only little, I was the research assistant on the ARC discovery project Genre Worlds, and that has really informed the way that I approach this. And so if you haven't come across the Genre Worlds research before, one of the kind of core tenets of a genre world, which draws on Howard S. Becker's theorization of the art world, is that a genre world is made up of three things. It's a sector of the publishing industry, it's a social formation, and it's a body of texts. And often in literary studies, there's a tendency to privilege the body of texts, to look just at the book. But what I'm really interested in are the kind of those other two things, the industrial side and the social formation side, which of course here we're talking about reading publics, reading communities are a really big part of that social side. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about a project I did with some of my old colleagues at UTAS, including Lisa Fletcher, who is one of the CIs on Genre Worlds, who was my boss for a while, where we were looking at, we started by looking at texts, and then we shifted that focus to books. We were like, what if we don't think about what is in these texts, so to speak? What if we think about these as material objects? And the project we did actually told us quite a lot about sociality and a lot about reading. And in particular, the books we were studying were these guys, Mills and Boon, category romance. So I've got a fun selection for you here. Here's an older one from the 80s. This is, I think, kind of 2011. No, this would be like 2015. This one's kind of more 2011. This is 2018. So you can see their paratexts update themselves. But yeah, when we think about Mills and Boon, we often don't think about what's in them. I can talk about what's in them. That's a whole other fascinating discussion. But this project was very much about them as books and how they traveled. So if you're not familiar with what category romance is, this kind of book, when we think about romance fiction, we kind of think about it in two ways. So there is what's called single title romance fiction, which my own work, Libby Lawrence, we could think about that as single title romance fiction. But then there's category romance fiction, which are books released under a common imprint or series name. They're numbered sequentially, so you probably can't see this, but on the spine here, this one is 617, and they're released at regular intervals, usually monthly, with about the same number of releases each time. So this one, for instance, was released in the Mills and Boon Sexy line, which is now called the Mills and Boon Modern line. It was number 617. I don't know what month it was, but it would have been released in 1 month. They're kind of released a little bit like magazines in that way. They're distinguished from other kinds of romance novels largely by format, because they are in these lines. Some lines are distinctive to specific national territories. They're named differently between territories, even though they're the same book. And each line has specific publisher guidelines, and these dictate things like length and character type and plot elements and historical and geographical setting and level of sexual content, tone. They're not like, there's kind of this pervasive myth about Mills and Boon that there is a formula, like on page 110 there has to be a sex scene. That's not true, but there are kind of overarching guidelines, and these are scaffolded by the overarching publisher brand, ensuring that they are immediately recognizable and categorizable. We also access them in different ways than we might access a normal book. I can't go into Dymocks and buy a Mills and Boon. If I want to buy a print copy, I have to go to a discount department store. So I would go to Kmart or BW or somewhere, and I would look for the specific Harlequin branded section, or an online retailer, or I can subscribe during Mills and Boon, through the Mills and Boon website rather. or I can buy them online. Ebooks are very popular. But the point I want to make here is that these are not books in the way that other books are books. We treat them differently. Often we think about books as something that we want to endure. The logic here is different. These kiss shelves fleetingly. They don't linger on them. They're released monthly. They only remain on retail shelves until they're superseded by the next monthly category, the next month's catalogue. Kind of like magazines, although they do have ISBNs rather than ISSNs. So the point here, category romance is as much distinctive for its distribution and for its content. And because of this, I'm sure many of you will have come across this before, Mills and Boon are often perceived as trash. And so Anne Curtois and John Docker describe Mills and Boon as a roaming punitive signifier for sub-literature, para-literature, trash or schlock. And if the phrase like trashy books encompasses a lot of popular fiction, Mills and Boon is perceived as being the trashiest, the lowest form within it. Now there's a ton of scholarship which seeks to rehabilitate the romance and to speak up for its literary merit, including the literary merit of Mills and Boon. So for instance, Laura Vivanco's For Love and Money, The Literary Art of the Harlequin Mills and Boon Romance. But if we read with the grain of the publishing practices of these books, that doesn't necessarily contradict the viewpoint. The publishing practices of Mills and Boon seem to suggest that category romance is not subject to the same logics of canonicity or archivability as other types of novels. They celebrate volume and scale. There's an often repeated claim by Harlequin is the parent company of Mills and Boon, by the way, that one of their books is sold every 2 seconds or every 4 seconds or every 10 seconds. They can never agree on how many seconds it is, but this claim is repeated all the time. The promise is typicality, not exceptionality. The marketing here doesn't necessarily promise rereadability. However, that's just if we read with the grain of the marketing. And as scholars, I'm sure we are all very used to reading against the grain of all kinds of things. So one of the core questions we had going into this project is, what do readers do? Do they read with the grain? Do they read against the grain? How do they interact with these books that people so frequently call trash and that the publishing practices themselves seem to suggest are interchangeable and infinitely reproducible and replicable? And so we could hypothesize that if, as Brian Thill argues, waste is any object plus time, then the time period between reading and the bin would be very short. However, 2 members of the 4 in the team, including me, have been immersed in romance scholarship and romance community for a very long time. At the same time we were doing this project, I got my first sale ribbon from the Romance Writers of Australia. And so we kind of sensed that this might not be the case, that people might not be reading with the grain of the marketing and treating these like trash. So what we did is we used the National Library of Australia's catalogue, because it's the most complete record we have of category romance. We selected 50 category romance novels by Australian authors first published by Harlequin and or Mills and Boon between 1996 and 2016. So we used 10 each from 96, 2001, 2006, 2011 and 2016. And we collected visual and textual data about the existence and the locations of physical copies of these books over 3 months, using 3 different social media platforms, so Facebook, Instagram and Twitter, by asking people to send us shelfies, so pictures of the book on shelves where they found them. And so our question here was, if you are looking for a specific Mills and Boon title in print, you can't just go to a bookstore and request it. You can't even go to a library and request it, because often they don't record the metadata. They just say Mills and Boon romance. They don't have the author. They don't have the title. And Vasily Kiveros has done some very good research on this in the Australian context. So our question here was, how difficult is it to find a Mills and Boon print edition once it leaves a shelf? A question that was originally about books quickly turned out to be about sociality. So we just wanted to find out at first where these books were circulating, but what we found told us about reader practice. So briefly, overall, we got 192 shelfies, and they captured 46 of the 50 books on our list, which was a lot more than we were expecting. And they were predominantly found in 4 places. So retail outlets where new books are sold, particularly for the new ones, retail outlets where secondhand books are sold, libraries, and most interestingly, private collections. So in some of these other locations, the public locations, this logic of trash was kind of reinforced. So for instance, we had one shelfie that came from a charity shop with a picture of one of the books in a basket labelled Mills and Boon, 50 cents each unless priced. So not exactly placing a great deal of value on the book there. Though interestingly, the sheer number of Mills and Boon paperbacks published per month, it's something like 130. That ensures that a lot of these must end up as waste, but we didn't receive any photos of the books treated as such. We wondered whether we were going to get some photos where it was like a picture of a Mills and Boon in the bin with like a snarky caption that was like, where it belongs. We didn't get any of that. So to shift to kind of the private collections, we didn't ask people to arrange their shelfies, but many did. There was a real ethos of care and an ethos of value in the way people staged the books on their shelves. It was clear people really valued the books in their private collections, and they set them up in these very pleasing aesthetic ways. So it's kind of hard to tell here, but each line has got a different colour spine, and people would set up these beautifully colour blocked shelves, and then commenters on the posts would comment on the beauty of these collections. And a word that came up a lot was keeper. A lot of people talked to us about their keeper shelves, and they would pick out specific books on our list and be like, oh yeah, that one's on my keeper shelf. That's a desert island book. And what it showed to us was that these books, which are so often considered trashy, were readily repurposed and reframed by the community as treasure. And a secondary finding of this project, which we weren't necessarily aiming for, but we got, it really revealed to us how highly networked the romance community is. So we used the social media analytics software Netlytic to map where our social media responses were coming from. And there were some big nodes. This methodology, our results were probably skewed, honestly, because our method appealed to genre insiders rather than genre outsiders, which might be why we didn't get any photos of like a Mills and Boon in the bin saying this is where it belongs. It was people who were very much in the in group. But what it also demonstrated was genre literacy, genre competence, and how inside outside the marketing of these books is. So a genre outsider might just see reproducibility in a Mills and Boon, but an insider can see the densely coded signals here and read past the paratext. And so what our findings actually revealed, we were trying to work out how books moved through the market, but it really revealed the significance of sociality to the material lives and afterlives of romance novels, and showed how much people love these books, how much they treasure them when they're often conceived of as trash. So that is all I have to say today. Thank you.
Thanks, Jodi. Oh, that was such a lively and energetic presentation. Amazing, and complete with lots of books on display. I noticed how both you and Torika talked about shelves quite a lot, and Torika said these books are burning a hole in my shelf, or shelves, in her email that she read out, and you talked about how romance works often kiss shelves fleetingly in bookshops, but obviously they're treasured and put into beautiful collections, colour-coded collections in people's houses. I love that idea of tracing where books have gone to after they've been bought, and that really tells you a lot about the sociality of reading. But I should move on and introduce our third wonderful speaker, Roger Osborne, whose research concentrates on Australian literature and British modernism, seen through the lens of book history, magazine culture and scholarly editing. He's done a lot, which I can't get into here, but his work on the transnational nature of Australian print culture has been published widely, and he's a chief investigator on the ARC-funded special research initiative, Read All About It, Digital Participation in Australian Newspapers. And this project aims to transform understandings of Australian literary history by using innovative digital methods to discover, curate and investigate tens of thousands of unrecorded novels, novellas and short stories in 20th century newspapers. Over to you, Roger.
Thank you. Thanks, Jodi and Torika. That was fantastic to listen to both of you speak, because it sort of captures some of the things that that come up in my work as well, particularly the idea of spaces and material. I was trying to frame like a big general question that my work asks, and it kind of comes up in both of your talks. It's like, how did this book actually get here? And that's the question that crops up in all of the research I do. So I sort of fit in that print culture history of the book world of investigation. But I look at the phenomenon of the relationship between the writer and the reader, and I see that as a process rather than concentrating on the product, like Jodi was talking about, sort of moving outside of that end result to think about the process. How did this book actually get to this place? That was some. I'm just thinking about all of those wonderful libraries that you were talking about, Torika, and that reminded me of doing research on School of Arts libraries and mechanics institutes and finding things in there, and then asking that question, well, how did that get here? Something that you might expect to find somewhere else in the United States or in England, but it just finds itself into maybe even the remotest Mallee. School of Arts or Mechanics Institutes, Brigid? I'm not sure what's out in the Mallee, but probably both.
Lots of mechanics institutes, but lots of them are defunct.
Right. So it's thinking about what we're asking questions of as a process rather than a product. It sort of led me in all of my work to concentrate on, like, I'm really interested in the shelfie of finding that, of seeing that book on that particular shelf at that particular time, and thinking about, what does that mean? I'm sort of intrigued by that. I'm going to have to stop thinking about it and just get to my part. But in really thinking about that and thinking about the types of readers who are involved, who have an agency in finding a place for a particular book at a particular time. Those are the sorts of questions that I ask myself, and I've got so many notes down here, Jodi and Torika. I'm sort of looking at them, trying to pull them into what I'm talking about myself. But it is that transmission, and that's kind of the if I've got a show and tell as well, it is a rather a material and spatial one, because I wanted to throw in all of the different types of readers that we engage with in asking questions about these processes that we might talk about. So this is, I'm not sure how well you're going to see any of this, but I've got material where you can look at the work of somebody like, this is Joseph Conrad and Maddox Ford's handwriting on here, working together in the same place. There's a process leading from manuscript to a book publication, but they're both reading at that same time and making decisions about what comes next. And particularly when you have another phenomenon like this, when you have revision as well, the writer reading and revising. Even late in life, Conrad's still doing this. You're not going to see this, but you get the idea that even 14 years after the fact of writing the first words about Nostromo in 1902, in 1918, he still feels like he has to make revisions to make it new, but as a reader in the first place. And so I'm really interested in events, and that's where this spatial and material aspects that Torika and Jodi are talking about really resonate with me. That you can, and it's really interesting, Torika. I'm sort of looking all over the place on my screen, but I'm not sure what that looks like on my end. That Torika gave us a point in time, that 2011, when everything started. I'm kind of really excited when I see things happening at a particular time in a particular place. It's an event that's happening in space in which there are participants. So Linda's promised to haul me up if I go too far, but I sort of wanted to generate some questions out of all of that for the way that we look at the way that we look at literary, well, the writing that we value. I'm going to take literary out of my mouth and put it aside for a minute. So the types of writing that we value, and that was an interesting in Jodi's talk, the trash or treasure notion, that it can change from place to place and person to person and from time to time. So the work that I've been doing with David Carter on working out how Australian authors had their works published in the United States of America, we're proceeding into working on the second volume at the moment, and I've this is kind of work in progress stuff for me. What I'm going to do in the winter, not some of it, what I'm going to do in the winter. It's looking at John Cleary and the way that John Cleary's work moved around the world. So he's predominantly published in England first, but he had a career in the United States of America as well. Success, I'm going to say the word success, but what is success? Success that he maintained a career for 30, 40 years and wrote dozens and dozens of novels. But what interests me is the process that enabled multiple versions of his work to appear. So I'm going to make sure I hold up the right ones here. So this is the English edition of Justin Bayard. So it's quite a nice edition. And I certainly wouldn't give this like its value in terms of, you know, the big L literature is pretty low on the scale, but as far as its cultural value, it's quite significant. So English version looks like this. The American version looks like this. So this is Collins, and this is Morrow in New York. So they look very different on the outside, and what I found in looking closely, they're very different on the inside as well. This edition has 20,000 more words than this edition. I've worked out where the changes are, but haven't determined what the meaning of that is. But what is central to that is readers and reading, particularly those involved within a publishing house, the editors, the commissioning editors, the proofreaders, those people who are making decisions about the shape any book should have for the market of readers. Cleary's thrown up a lot of good examples for me to think further about, and maybe at another time I'll be able to say what the results are. But I also came across this book here. It's one of his earlier ones in Justin Bayard, Climate of Courage. You can sort of get an idea from the cover what you're going to get if you open the pages and have a look inside. So that's Collins. That's the English version. So here comes the American edition. And so what I've found is that so there's 12,000 words difference in this one. So this the story of soldiers on leave in Sydney from Papua New Guinea. There were all sorts of challenges about relationships, etc., etc. But the way that it was packaged and marketed for an American audience, this is that marketplace in the newsagents and the grocery stores that Jodi was talking about as well. So it's that idea of transformation that I'm really interested in. That's kind of central to my work, to be able to not see a work as a single product, but there are processes involved, and that it's really interesting that the changes that happen, not just those textual and material changes that you can easily see, but I'm really interested in the same sorts of questions that come up when you think about what happens when this particular book is found in this particular library. It's such a meaningful work that Torika is doing, and Jodi's work in the same way. It's sort of all sorts of things are flashing off in my head at the moment. So if nobody else has any questions in the audience, I have plenty for Jodi and Torika, and I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Roger. and also Jodi and Torika. So while you're all catching your breath to think about some questions to ask of the speakers, there's just a kind of a tech point to make. You can either, we'd encourage you to actually go on mic and preferably even on camera to ask your question, in which case you do need to enable that on your own screen on the top right corner of the window. Just look for that leave button, but don't leave, and just turn a little bit left and click on the mic symbol, because we would love to hear you ask your question. And if you're really game enough, I don't know why you wouldn't be, click on the camera icon as well. Short of that, if you'd like to put a question into the chat, which again you can do if you don't know, you can put just sliding along further left on that top area of the screen, there's a chat icon. Click on there and you'll be able to put your question there, and I will read it out. Look, in the meantime, while you're composing your thoughts in the room for questions, I just wanted to sort of draw together all of this very fast-paced and multi-splintering, in my mind, set of thoughts and themes that you've really conversed around this idea of reading, readerships, socialities, and all the different contexts in which you're speaking of them. But one particular thing that comes to mind, and I'll come back to you, Torika, was I felt as though you specifically said you're seeking in terms of the community reading room. It's been a pop-up library. It started in Footscray. It's moved across around parts of Melbourne. You said you're seeking a more permanent location, and I can see why you would want to do that. It's an incredibly productive and dynamic means of connecting for the particular groups that you were speaking of. But I just wondered if you'd given some thought about what would be the value, like what might be the affordances of continuing to have it as a pop-up, as a mobile library, a mobile community library that doesn't put down roots, so to speak, even while you're perhaps, you know, on the other hand, still working towards seeking to put down some roots and to make it permanent. Is there any thoughts about that tension there that you could add?
Yeah, I love, there's so many great examples of mobile libraries, and and actually my mum used to do mobile libraries. I've just sort of reconnected with that. She went travelling on a bus all around Tasmania when she was working for Women's Health. They had a llama visit one day and kissed visitors who popped onto the bus. But that, you know, that kind of, maybe without the llama or with the llama, travelling book collection, I love because of the way you can connect and bring collections to communities that might otherwise not have access to them. So I think there's a really nice balance there, and it would be great to sort of maintain both. But what I really think is important is to kind of have a location that people can go to and actually build a consistent community of practice, really. They know that they can visit, and it's a destination that has a home. Yeah, I think it'd be really great to have both, really.
Yeah, I can see that would be great. And perhaps piggybacking on that idea too, that your sense, Torika, your sense of readership is what you would call it, you know, a small scale readership. It's not yet the intimate publics or the intimate reading group that I know Jodi has explored in her research, but these different scales of reader formations, of these different scales of socialities that each of you have really kind of hinted at, but particularly contrasting Roger and Jodi's interest in sort of larger scale, much more clearly, you know, market, perhaps market to an extent market driven or industry-driven readerships, but also then the formations, Jodi, that occur, the socialities that occur within the market. So, Jodi, perhaps to you, have you thought about the these scales with your interest in romance genre, romance class, the hashtag romance class project that you're involved in, which you haven't spoken of here but perhaps could, how these different scales of publics form around romance.
Yeah, I'm really interested in questions of scale and romance, because questions of mass and volume, though these are often used as justifications for romance's worth, that romance is everywhere, that romance pays for the rest of the industry, like romance is so big and so mighty and so powerful and we don't get any respect, like this common rallying cry. And so there's a sense that the romance readership is very, very big, which it is, but that also homogenizes the readership considerably, and it reinforces the North American driven publishing industry's dominance over the genre. And so I'm really interested both in my work on Australia and my work on romance class, which is Filipino romance, specifically English language Filipino romance, though we've been doing a little bit of work on Tagalog romance as well, my team and I there. They're kind of creating these smaller communities, these micro communities, and in some ways very closed communities. Like romance class has got quite a high barrier to entry, shall we say, to get into that community. It's a walled garden, and they within the wall is a lot of love, but they maintain those walls in a way which is really like productive for them, I think. Like I don't want to suggest that that's a bad thing, because I think it actually helps them do quite a lot of work as a community. Anyway, that's a tangent. But I'm really interested in how these smaller communities form within the kind of this kind of enormous readership that romance is supposed to have, and how they resist a lot of times, particularly North American hegemony, but also all kinds of hegemony, like white hegemony, straight hegemony. We could make a long, long list here.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just noting in the chat we've got Brigid's added in, but she can speak to it. Brigid's added in that her cousin in Aotearoa, New Zealand, runs a mobile library service with books in Te Reo, my pronunciation's not great, in Maori language. And we do have these visions, Torika. I'm thinking of just that gorgeous kind of mid-20th century kind of that caravan, or that kind of old-fashioned school bus that can travel around those distant locations where still perhaps today, but certainly from a long time, there've been, the volume of the access to books has not always been great, and is certainly vastly disparate to access to books in larger metropolitan areas. So the mobility is really of the library is really important. Jodi and there's another comment there too from Peter, has had passing contact with a UK-based project called the Women's Walking Library, and it may be of some interest. There's a link there in the chat. Jodi and Roger, you two particularly spoke to the reading against the grain, I think was the expression you used, Jodi, but also with Roger, you're looking at, you focused on texts and genres that don't have this conventional literary value, and the ways in which readers and readerships can revalue particular texts and particular works. Roger, do you want to speak a little bit more to that way in which the transvaluing or the revaluing of what might be thought of as more trashy or lower value texts? Can you bring your reader communities a little bit more into the foreground from what you've been looking at?
Yep, I'll give it a go. I mean, genre is an important part of all of that. Now, I'll use the American Publishers Project as the example, because what we found, like one of the bounties that we have as researchers is what survives in the archive, and like particularly the correspondence between people within a publishing house, or the way that the books have been reviewed, so those records of readers. But it's interesting in terms of Australian novels. That's what we concentrate on, how they find a place in the United States of America. It's a continuing a case of rediscovery that you find in all of the in a lot of the correspondence. And then there is, in the correspondence or readers' reports that survive, you see the readers worrying over about, what is this thing that I have in front of me? How do I define it? What did they say? I don't understand. So there's a lot of translation that needs to happen. But in those conversations that you see behind the scenes, genre does come in as a Jodi, help me, categorization of what this thing is for us in this place. We can't recognize it as as Australian, but we can recognize it as detective fiction, or we can recognize it as adventure fiction. And for us in that project, that really ramped up in the 1920s and beyond, earlier than that, when genre really started to emerge in the first decades of the 20th century. That that categorization that Jodi's talked about enabled publishers and people who worked in publishing houses. It enabled them to be able to select works for publication more confidently, but then it also gave the readers who were making decisions about what they were going to purchase or where they were going to find it. It gave them a language, a vocabulary in order to make the decisions. So for me, it's thinking about readers reading and then acting on that and doing something, whether it's revision or whether it's accepting this book into a series or whether it's rejecting this book for whatever reason. Did I answer your question there, Linda? I'm not sure.
I think so. Thanks, Roger. Back over to you, Torika. Feel free, anyone, to jump in on mic or put your question in on the chat. Torika, I had an image as you were describing the community reading room, and you described, or you mentioned that when it was based in Footscray, well certainly in Footscray, where it's largely based, you have local students from VU, you had people who lived near where you'd set up, and you had people who were travelling there. Can you give us a bit more of a picture about their interactions when they came together around, like, how was the handling? Because I'm coming eventually to talking about these kind of more, I guess, haptic elements of reading, the touching and the feeling that is associated with the kinds of reading experiences that I think at least two of you, if not the three of you, are kind of also nudging towards as being part of this reading sociality. So Torika, can you give us a bit of a picture of how that works at the community reading room?
Yeah, it's a great question, because it does change with every different audience and every different space it's in. When it's located in a random shop front, people don't know if it's a shop or if it's, they don't sort of know how it's going to behave. It's very different when you put it inside a gallery and people come in and they are expecting to be spectators rather than actively involved in sitting down and engaging with the collection. So it takes a bit of time. Testing grounds was probably the most kind of interesting for me to observe people interacting. For those of you who are familiar with the space, or not familiar with the space, it exists as as three sort of discrete art spaces. And so when people are walking through, general public are walking through, often tourists who are staying in the high-rise accommodation around the place, they're not really sure what they're experiencing. So I've had people kind of bring in their lunch, just sit down and make themselves at home. Other people kind of walk in and see the types of books and go, no, this is not for me, I'm out of here. And then people who come in and want to have like really long and deep conversations about particular aspects. But there's a really interesting chapter in this book, I don't know if you can see, called Shelf Documents, Art Library as Practice. And there's a chapter in here which is very much about that kind of somatic interaction with books as objects and in libraries, and the design of libraries and collections, which I think was all like came up so much in all of our discussions. We've sort of needed the visuals to go with it because we're all talking about the kind of the material qualities of the books. Yeah, so that interaction with collections changes every time, and I think that's why what I find really valuable about running that project, and also the way that people are really proactively engaged in the space. So there'll be, the collection might be there. There'll be people making zines. People bring their own books to sit in the collection for the duration of the installation, and then come and get it at the end. So it's sort of it moves from this kind of passive library kind of thing to very much an active participation. And and as people become more familiar with the idea of the project, that that happens more.
Great, thank you. Jodi, I'm still wanting to plug you more on that. Reading about the #romance class, I'm really taken by some of the kind of the spin-off activities that occur when in the Philippines with this particular genre of fiction. It seems as though the people are gathering together not simply to read already written romance, but also to self-publish, to write, and then they come away with this stronger sense of what seems to be most important is this sense of, well, the term that was used in one of your papers was a family, that there's a sense of such a degree of belonging to this reading community, this reading group, known to each other or perhaps not prior to that event, and they describe it as family. That was a surprise to you, was it?
Well, we had, done some research beforehand, so to an extent we knew what we were walking into when we did our fieldwork in Manila, which was just before COVID. It was October 2019. So, I mean, it's easy for me to say we knew what we were walking into, but we couldn't have understood what we were walking into, I think. We went to one of their live reading events that Romance Class do. Romance Class, by the way, if you have not come across them, which I imagine most of you have not, is a self-publishing collective in the Philippines who publish English language romance. Their website is romanceclassbooks.com if you want to look at them. But there's about 100 authors and the associated artists, readers and actors. So they use local actors as their cover models, but also to do their live reading events. So they've created their own stock photo library for book covers, which I think is just like the coolest project because they couldn't find any stock photos with Filipino people on them. But these live reading events are like incredibly emotive. So there is a term in Tagalog which cannot really be translated into English very well, which is kilig, which is the sense where you're so excited by something that it overflows physically. So often associated with fangirling, though the way it was explained to me when I finally got it was the 2005 version of Pride and Prejudice where Darcy holds Lizzie's hand to help her up into the carriage and then he does the hand flex afterwards. They were like, that's killing. And I was like, oh, I get it now. But killing is very much a shared emotion. It's collective. And so seeing the killing at these events where they've got their local actors reading excerpts from these books and seeing how the authors and the community react in the room with like screaming or hiding their faces. When they go quiet is really interesting. When they get loud is so interesting. These kind of events really, really help to form these emotional bonds, which are almost like family.
Yeah. Thank you. Look, it's just before 2 o'clock and I still feel like I want to pick up a number of other sort of themes, and particularly, Torika, your dismay at the university and academia and I want, and really each of you have kind of spoken of reading that happens with not even really a nod to, well, I was going to say without the formal educational institutions. Yes, there's the literature institutions and so on, but I would have liked to have kind of seen whether we could pick up a theme there about the nature of, outside large institutions of reading and formal reading, sites of reading, and what your various projects might link in with that. But it is 2 o'clock and I haven't yet had a question from the floor or through the chat line, so I think we're going to need to leave it there, and just thank everyone in the room for coming along. I've really enjoyed hearing from each of the three of you. It's just been so interesting to hear about these different reading socialities, and it looks like we're about to get kicked out. So, oh, there's the thanks for watching slide. If you want to know about more events from the Nonfiction Lab in the future, that's the link you can go to. And I think that's where you can also see a recording of this lecture, or this presentation rather, not even this lecture. Okay, I've got screens and tiles flashing in front of me. Thank you again, Roger, Jodi and Torika, and also to you, Brigid, and everybody in the room. So I'll call it a day there. Thank you very much.